The horror genre is often thought of as a particularly interactive experience. Great horror films are known to elicit some of the most extreme reactions out of its spectator. In video games, arguably where the genre thrives the most, horror attains a direct line to the player. But painting, as an artistic medium, is not exactly known for its horror qualities. Although that more subtle, creeping feeling one gets when experiencing a good work of horror can definitely be experienced through painting as well. As we sort of saw in Layers of Fear, for example. I highly recommend you watch my video on that game in case you haven't. Paintings can unsettle us in a particular way, because although we are of course afraid of monsters, be they physical or metaphysical, a thinker like Carl Jung would argue we also, to some extent, fear ourselves, our shadow, our repressed or unacknowledged traits we won't dare show to others, our capacity for violence, or even our desire for violence, our paranoias, which at their extremes might border on madness. The list goes on. Painting has historically been a medium characterized by its possibility for introspection, especially since it's almost always made by a single artist, and so it will inevitably contain some form of self-expression, whether the artist intends to or not, and therefore it will, to some extent, portray the shadow and reflect it back to us. If we are going to talk about horror in painting, we of course have to talk about Francisco Goya. Goya was an incredibly talented and successful court painter, and much of his early work depicts graceful, noble scenes in a beautiful and idyllic Spain. It's incredibly orderly. Everything is in its rightful place. At the height of his artistic career, Goya comes down with a mysterious illness, the nature of which is still unknown. Some say it was lead poisoning, others say it could have been syphilis. In any case, he suffered greatly through various symptoms, hallucinations, vertigo, and most notably, he begins to lose his hearing. And as his physical and mental state worsen, his paintings begin to lose that lightheartedness, and he starts exploring darker subjects. One day, he begins to paint the art of an asylum, filled with what at the time would be considered the criminally insane. He was not commissioned for this work, he was not getting paid for it, but something propelled him to depict these scenes on the canvas. His reason for depicting these scenes was to, and I quote, "occupy my imagination, tormented as it is by contemplation of my sufferings." Goya was plagued by the thought of his own madness. In the figures of the asylum, he appears to have recognized something within himself, and as Goya was losing his hearing, you could say he was also losing a sense or a channel of interaction with the rest of the world, isolating him, forcing him inwards towards even deeper introspection. But too much introspection can sometimes border on paranoia, and the line between sanity and insanity was becoming thinner and thinner. This psychological unraveling, let's call it, was showing itself against the backdrop of Napoleon's invasion of Spain and the extremely brutal guerrilla warfare that followed. In his Disaster of War series, Goya depicts the Peninsular War with brutal honesty, executions, mutilations, portraying simply cruelty with no hint of heroism, without any justification. I guess you could say without any reason. Goya was an educated man, no doubt shaped by the Enlightenment ideals of the time, particularly the belief in reason as the main guiding principle of human affairs, and in the hope that rational inquiry, education, would undoubtedly lead to moral and political progress. But instead, Goya is confronted with violence and death and cruelty of all sorts with no discernible reason. In his final years, now fully deaf, Goya isolated himself even further in his villa, known as Quinta del Sordo, the Villa of the Deaf One, and begins painting in its interior walls. In the black paintings, as they are called, no more do we see the idyllic noble scenes he once painted in his youth. We see Spain as a dark and dreary place, its people consumed by madness and religious fervor that didn't seem to bring them any sort of salvation. Looking not so different from the inmates of the asylum, the world revealed itself to Goya as cruel, chaotic, and totally without reason. One painting that I believe characterizes Goya's present condition is the painting simply known as El Perro, vast empty space. and out from under some unidentifiable mass, a dog's head, peeking out to see all the world's chaos. We of course don't have Goya's explanation for these works, but I like to imagine Goya painted some of himself in this dog. The lonely old man, now half mad, looking at the world, scared of all its chaotic uncertainty. But of course, if we are to talk about the black paintings, we have to talk about the most famous, or infamous, of these pieces. Saturn devouring his son. Here we see depicted the mythical Greek tale of Saturn devouring his son, due to fearing he would eventually overthrow him. And besides being so visually striking, with its aggressive brushstrokes, its clear rejection of any romantic interpretation of the story, I think this piece truly says it all. It's a complete rejection of reason. It's chaos incarnate. In a reasonable world, a child is who devours the parent. Or should I say, a parent allows him or herself to be devoured by their child, emotionally, financially. There's an undeniable aspect of self-sacrifice within parenthood. But here Goya might be showing us his view of the world as he saw it. The complete inversion of order. The parent destroys the future to preserve himself. A total collapse of what once seemed to be the natural order. Our every action dominated by fear. It's somewhat difficult to box Andrew Wyeth into a particular genre, as is the case with many artists, I suppose. He's a bit of a realist, an impressionist, an abstractionist, but whatever label you apply to him, there's no doubt that he was impressively consistent in his style. Wyeth almost always depicts his surroundings as incredibly lonely and barren. The sun never shines too brightly, the colors are always muted, as if the world is in the process of overcoming some sort of illness, and they rarely contain people. And when they do, they are often alone and avoidant, almost as if they were not the subject of the painting at all. There's this pervasive loneliness in all these paintings that I imagine came fairly naturally to Wyeth. He grew up with relatively poor health, and his parents decided to homeschool him. This by itself would limit the amount of psychological activity in his world, during of course his most formative years. So much of our personality is shaped by conflict with other people. And by conflict I don't mean fighting, although that does certainly have a large impact as well. When I say conflict, I mean the natural tension that comes with interacting with others, forming new friendships, new relationships, ending relationships, experiencing new phenomena. To add on to that, his father, Newell Wyeth, who was an artist himself, was his only teacher. So we see here a constant theme of stagnation in his life. And I don't mean to get too Freudian, but I imagine a learned passivity under his father, where he becomes not so much an active participant in the world, but more so a voyeur to it. When speaking about his relationship with his father in those early years, Wyeth said, "Pa kept me almost in jail, just kept me to himself in my own world, and he wouldn't let anyone in on it." It's no wonder that his paintings are so serene, but perhaps because of their serenity, are also incredibly lonely, so devoid of life, stagnant, replete with grand open spaces. It's almost as if someone lived their entire life in their own internal world, and is only now finally looking outside themselves to find that life continued on without them. And now they are left alone, with only tombstones and old buildings to keep them company. I understand that I am reading too deeply into this, that is what I do on this channel, but I can't help but see a real longing for meaning within these landscapes, which is both incredibly beautiful, but also extremely heartbreaking. Now that I'm interpreting Andrew Wyeth's work in this broader sense, looking at both his life and his portfolio, I wonder if perhaps he portrayed this internal experience, or something similar, in his most famous piece, Christina's World. Here he depicts a local girl, Anna Christina Olsen, who had developed some kind of muscular disorder in her childhood, meaning she was unable to walk, and for some reason she is incredibly far away from her home. We do not know how she ended up here, and we do not know how she will make it back. Perhaps Wyeth saw himself in Christina here, being placed onto the world surrounded by its vastness, without the tools to navigate it. unsure on whether to crawl back to the stagnant comfort of his home or to move ahead into the unpredictable openness of the world. Perhaps I'm the one projecting my own psychological discomfort, but nevertheless, I believe Andrew Wyeth's work become great pieces of horror, and more specifically psychological horror, for the same reason Team Silent found them inspiring for the Silent Hill games. In particular, Silent Hill 2, since that game takes a much more somber, surreal, and introspective tone. It's within the barrenness, the stillness, the lack of life itself, that we are given the opportunity to look within. It's in the emptiness that our shadow becomes unavoidable. And to harken back to my introduction, the prospect of having our shadow reflected back to us and having to confront it can be a truly terrifying affair. Keeping with the theme of artists who ended up inspiring the artistic direction of the Silent Hill games, we have the Irish figurative painter Francis Bacon, who is known for making these strangely unsettling paintings of figures who appear to be fighting themselves, almost fighting their own flesh. Looking at his portraits in particular, one gets the idea that the face of his subject is in constant motion, shifting to accommodate a much more complicated inner world. Let's take a look at his portrait of George Dyer and Lucian Freud, as an example of how Bacon captures one's inner psychological experience, one's personality and demeanor through his painting, and how it's as if the body, the flesh, struggles to accommodate this complexity. On the left we see George Dyer, who appears slightly more relaxed, and his head appears to shift and move in a big, sweeping, confident motion, addressing all the attendees of this club or this bar. Lucian Freud to the right, however, appears closed off, squeezing into the frame, and his face making smaller, more neurotic movements. But these are generally light-hearted banalities, and they are not necessarily negative qualities. We all know the human unconscious houses much darker material. In his Man in Blue series, Francis Bacon gives loneliness a suffocating physical form. A sharply dressed man appears to lose himself in solitude. His face has few discernible features. When I spoke about Andrew Wyeth, I mentioned how much of our personality is shaped by conflict with others. The question here is, how much exactly? Francis Bacon leaves us with a very terrifying possibility. Perhaps without that conflict, which in so many other of his paintings appear to be so painful, it's as if we dissolve into nothingness. Through immense loneliness, it's as if we begin to lose form altogether, just as the man in blue seems to bleed into the background. Bacon's breakout works, however, were his studies of the crucifixion, specifically 3 studies for figures at the base of a crucifixion, which were meant to sit at the base of a crucifixion, which he never painted. It appears as if Bacon's fascination with the crucifixion has less to do with Christian theology and seems to be more so a meditation on suffering itself, suffering in its rawest form, and for no particular reason, suffering as simply a fact of life, using the crucifixion as its main symbol. Art critic John Russell writes that, to Bacon, the crucifixion was a generic name for an environment in which bodily harm is done to one or more persons, and one or more other persons gather to watch. And let's hone in on that last part, where other persons gather to watch, as it is a constant theme here. We see in fragments of a crucifixion, for example, little people walking towards the gruesome representation of a crucified figure. And of course, in the 3 studies, these figures are meant to simply be present at the base of a crucifixion. They are simply witnesses to it, and perhaps are turned into these monster-like figures because of it. And this is where the psychological horror-like quality of his work is really pronounced. Here, Bacon might be hinting at another horrible and uncomfortable reality, at our unconscious, innate capacity and desire for violence. And so this could be the purest form of the idea I talked about during the intro of this video. Francis Bacon is reflecting our most horrible shadow qualities back to us. If we do take a sort of theological angle to this, is it not true that the perpetrators of Christ's crucifixion were men of flesh and blood? And weren't the people who cheered for his torture men as well? Think of all the sufferings of the world. Think of all the sufferings throughout history. How many of them were caused by man himself? We are civilized animals, but we are animals nonetheless. Henry Fuseli was a Swiss painter who had built a reputation for giving form to works of literature, mainly the works of Shakespeare. But very often, Fuseli seemed to focus on elements of the supernatural and pronounce them in his work. The painting that arguably kick-started his career would have to be The Nightmare. Its title refers to the original meaning of the word nightmare, as a supernatural spirit or creature who would lay on top of a person sleeping, putting pressure on their chest even to the point of suffocation. This is now understood commonly as sleep paralysis. Here we see a woman dressed in white, laying in a very vulnerable position, almost as if surrendering herself to the small incubus, who stares at us, the viewer, menacingly. In the back, peering from the darkness, is a horse who appears to be blind, as his eyes are white and pupilless. I believe there is a clear psychosexual undertone to this piece, most obviously represented in the incubus. The incubus being essentially the male counterpart of a succubus, who invades women's dreams to seduce them or fornicate with them at the expense of the woman's physical and psychological well-being. Then we have the woman, with her long neck exposed and whose flowing dress hugs tightly her large hips. And finally we have the horse, which we could view as a symbol of male sexuality and vitality, especially since they are often portrayed as an overall masculine force in other artistic movements. But here, of course, the horse is blind, so perhaps it could mean male sexuality that is purely instinctual, which cannot self-regulate. Now, what I think really brings this painting into the realm of psychological horror is the idea that these creatures, from a psychological perspective, would not be supernatural entities. They would in fact reside within this very woman. They would be, to some extent, manifestations of unconscious desires, buried deep in her shadow. Essentially unintegrated shadow characteristics, to be specific. And Fuseli simply brings them into the material. This isn't too dissimilar from Silent Hill 2, because I can't seem to shut the fuck up about this game. The monsters there are to some extent James's psychic material made into physical monsters. His guilt, desire, repression, and so on. I actually made a video analyzing Silent Hill 2 through a Freudian and Jungian lens, if you want to watch that. But we can sort of make another connection here to Silent Hill, or I guess just to psychological horror in general, because this painting essentially places us, the viewer, within the scene through the incubus who looks directly at us, as if we are implicated in this nightmare in some way. We become voyeurs to this sort of act of psychosexual aggression. A lot like that very uncomfortable scene in Silent Hill 2 where James witnesses Pyramid Head committing a kind of sexualized violence against the mannequins. That scene, the scene from Blue Velvet which inspired it, and this painting all unsettle us by making us watch something we feel we shouldn't be watching at all. So there's this extra layer of horror behind the imagery itself, and the fact that we are almost made aware of our own curiosity, and so again, of our own shadow. And we feel guilty not because we caused the act, because in fact we didn't, but because we don't look away. And we might begin to realize that these monsters might live within us as well.
Whoa, Black Betty, bam, whoa, Black Betty, bam, Black Betty had a child, bam, don't think gonna wild, bam.